So this is the plan. I'll talk a little bit about myself, but not too much because I hate talking about myself. And then there's this notion of BIPOC identity. Just really let's kind of spend some time thinking about what we mean by this term, what are some limitations, acknowledging barriers, kind of like challenges in our industry, and then we'll do a scenarios activity. And then I'll talk about the core strategies that have really worked for myself as well as other successful BIPOC initiatives. And then I'll talk a little about these two things are really key for me, the diversity audit and having a vision and mission statement. And then I have some other strategies that we can discuss. I always like to end with positivity because I think there's a lot of positive things happening right now in Canada. And then I have a tool that will help you create like a checklist for your own learning, as well as a wish list for things that you would like to do. And checklists can also be used for your organization or your publication. So that is what we hopefully will have enough time to do all this stuff. If not, I will have to speed things up. So this is a little bit about me. I was born in Ottawa, traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples, and I'm first generation Chinese Canadian. I've been writing poetry and fiction since I was about a teenager, I think. I also have really unique parents that they're both artists, so creativity and arts was a very high priority in my household. And so I published my first poems when I was 19 in a magazine called Descant, which no longer is running, but it was a lovely journal. And I lived in Ottawa until I was 19 and came out here, actually, to UBC to do a degree and study English honors. I finished my degree at York. So I lived in Vancouver for about 7 years. I came over with unabashed love for the Canucks and for JJ Bean coffee, which I still enjoy. And then I went and did my master's in career writing at U of T. And then about 2 years ago, I published my first poetry collection. I also, in that time, just to earn income, wrote a lot of book reviews, did interviews with authors, and slowly also did some nonfiction for the Globe and Mail and other literary journals. In my professional experience, I've worked for some nonprofits and taught ESL, and I now currently work as an academic writing tutor for OCAD University. So that's kind of like my official bio, but this is sort of my involvement with BIPOC writers and communities, which really began around 2014. And I began an informal meetup with all the BIPOC identifying students and alumni of our career writing program at U of T. And I did that because it just something in me wanted to have kind of a conversation, because I was the only BIPOC student in my cohort, one of 7 students, but I knew there were 3 students from South Asian and mixed race ethnicities in the year below me, and I knew there were 1 or 2 in every year, and I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if we got together and had a conversation. And we've continued to meet and have that group grow, and because of those meetings, a lot of things kind of came out of that space that we create for dialogue. And some years we could only meet like once. Sometimes it was just 4 of us in a coffee shop. Some years it was 12 of us in like a boardroom. I keep shuffling us around the city, trying to find a space that would work and feel safe for us. So it's kind of ongoing. I began a newsletter for it last year. I've done some outreach for online magazines. It was mentioned previously that according to Fuel for Fire, this was the same year that my book came out, but it came about through a blog post I wrote about tokenism in Canadian literary prizes. And from that, I was able to work with the OAC to do a 1.5-day symposium for BIPOC emerging writers. And that was really, couldn't have been done without Jack Illingsworth and Bushra Junaid at the Ontario Arts Council. We're incredibly lucky, privileged to have Bushra as the educational officer there, as well as Jack Illingsworth, a literary arts officer. And then from also some of those discussions came about The Unpublished City, which is an anthology that we did with a partnership with Toronto Lit Up, Toronto Arts Council, and Harbourfront Centre. So just that's some of the things I'll talk about in the success stories. And yeah, just some other, just participating in sort of other symposium conferences with BIPOC organizers. And I think the biggest thing that I probably do is just like kind of informally mentor, I say that in a very loose way, and connect BIPOC writers to each other. And I found what was interesting when I began listing all these activities is that none of them are, really appear on my official bio. So all kinds of things that I feel like a little bit under the radar. I don't often talk about them. So it was useful for me to put them all in one space, and that all this activity really took place between 2014 and 2018. So in that it's been very, very concentrated. And when I moved back to Ontario in 2008, I didn't know any writers of color at all. And now they're such a part of my community. I'm such a part of their community. So this all happened really, really quickly. It probably means I haven't really got enough sleep since I was 35, but sleep can wait. We got to change things first. Yeah. I'm sure that's the case for many people in this room, and I think there's a lot of people who have been doing these kinds of initiatives for a long time. So I found this term, Black Indigenous person of color, to be a really, really interesting one. I think one that some people are a little bit uncomfortable with because I find it is useful but limited. Because person of color really seems to me to be kind of defined by negation. You're not white, therefore you're a person of color. So somehow this idea that whiteness is not a color. Even though we're not really sure what white culture or white identity could mean. It just means that this person is not a person who is, can identify with that, whatever dominant, mainstream, North American, WASP culture even. But that term, when you put it together, particularly with those acronyms, to me kind of implies this is one BIPOC identity. And I really don't find that to be the case because this term itself sublimates this whole wide range of experiences and histories. And then it's this kind of categorization that makes ethnicity sort of the main focus of one's identity. And as a result, sometimes prioritizes that relation to whiteness and difference that doesn't really have much basis in reason. When I try to rationalize the way I have been racialized, there is no basis or reason, no real difference between myself and another person that's not based in these kind of socialized categories that were culturally produced by, people writing biology textbooks saying that, a black person has this type of genetic makeup and an Asian person has this type of, genetic makeup. So it doesn't really have much of a genetic basis. So you're kind of giving someone a identity that's based on their history of racialization and exclusion rather than something that is inherent to them. So I think it also is a term that doesn't really take account into intersectionality because, an Asian female would be treated very different from a Black, Indigenous, or Native man. And it doesn't really take into account how every individual has already internalized aspects of the dominant culture, colonial values, and etc. So I think in the earlier panel, one of the speakers brought up that just because someone is also a BIPOC writer doesn't necessarily mean that they will support you, given their alignment to other types of identity markers and other values. So that's just something kind of I am myself really struggling with. So this is an example of that kind of complexity, intersectionality. These were the first, I think, these were about 5 people who showed up at that first meeting with the BIPOC MA, current MA, and alumni and Ka-Ir Wang students. I had a mixed race Quebecois Iranian female. She writes fiction. She's a French teacher. She was born in Sherbrooke on Quebec, but grew up in Mississauga. She's also cisgendered. There was a young Egyptian Muslim female international student who, from what I can tell, spends half her time in Cairo and half her time in Toronto. I never know where she is really, but she doesn't have citizenship. So, it was another kind of layer to her experience. There was a mixed race, a Chinese, half British fiction writer who grew up in Alberta. And there was a queer Cypriot Greek male writer who also has a disability, was born with a spinal defect. and he was from much lower income background. His parents were restaurant owners, and so technically he was not a BIPOC person. He was white identifying. Because of these other identity markers, we knew that he had experienced bullying, discrimination, so we thought he was a really important addition to our conversation. So, South Asian, Indian, Bengali, genderqueer, identifying fiction writer. I got this from her bio, and PhD student. So actually what's interesting about all 5 of these people is that we are from, mostly from a middle class kind of background. So, and we don't have any black writers in this. We didn't have any black writers because it was the U of T MA in Career Writing program. I don't think they had ever, we didn't know any black or indigenous students had ever been admitted to this program. So that already limited our conversation. But even with these 5 people in the room, we were able to have a really, really rich discussion, particularly about mixed race identity, which to me, for the mixed race Chinese writer, he was really concerned about his accuracy and whether or not it was his story to tell, something that I was privileged to not even have to think about, having Chinese parents on both sides. So I think if you keep those people in mind, it really helps to fill out, what BIPOC identity means for you. I found this really useful as well. The pyramid hate that I think was developed by the, what is it? I think it's a Jewish foundation, but this version of it was on a London Hate Crimes blog. When I first saw this, I think I was in a drama class, Canadian drama class, and we were looking at South African theater. And I found it really useful to identify what kinds of hate, different BIPOC individuals have experienced and communities have experienced, and where I was positioned in those types of experiences. So for me, I've been maybe excluded, maybe people have avoided me, I've had a little bit of name calling. Sometimes I have a lot of stereotypes, people asking me if I can speak English. But for example, I've never experienced, a cop telling me that I can't go somewhere, or asking for my identification, or victims of violence. I've never been beaten. I've never feared for, I've never had been threatened that way. So that really helped me to understand how to relate to individuals and communities and where they were coming from. So then taking some of those forms of discrimination, especially the ones from levels 1 and 2, and I began to kind of expand on them to think about the real barriers that I see BIPOC writers and artists experiencing. And these are not exclusive to just BIPOC people. I do know a lot of Caucasian people who experience, for instance, language and cultural barriers. I do know a lot of people who are not BIPOC who also experience mental health issues. What is really unique, and lack of representation in writing publishing, I think, and lack of role models and mentors, I see that being discussed more and more these days, and it's becoming a very, and that's something that it's kind of a luxury now that we don't have to go over that yet again, particular with this type of audience, that we kind of acknowledge that these are barriers. So I felt like for a long time, maybe even 10, 15 years ago, we were still kind of fighting for this kind of visibility in terms of just even acknowledging the barriers. Economic barriers. For some students or some emerging writers, the visibility of the arts as a career is usually because they're first-generation Canadian and their parents expect them to go into fields that will be more economically stable because they can't afford to support them. Or the culture is that you need to support your parents one day. So I know when I was at UBC, a lot of the Chinese students were studying business, were studying chemistry and engineering because they were kind of streamed into those fields with the expectation that they would be able to provide for their parents and grandparents in the future. There was a lot of pressure on them, particularly if they're the only child too, which was something I never experienced because my parents are very, very supportive of the arts. So it's like one more barrier. And because of that, sometimes they experience the mental health challenges. And then, so I just found that these all interrelate to each other. At some point, maybe I'll draw like a map of like how they intersect. But for example, someone who has mental health challenges and also doing the emotional work of teaching others, and feeling like their culture is being appropriated or their expertise is being appropriated, is going to now, not be able to know how to move forward because of the lack of mentors. So it's going to be cyclical. So it's going to make certain issues worse. So I know a fiction writer who is really struggling with mental health challenges, and also is the first in her generation to be a storyteller and a writer. And she can't really find mentors that will help her. And at her workplace, she's experiencing some discrimination and sort of condescending and sort of belittling. And so it's kind of all, and she's trying to connect with her own culture, learning. She feels shame for not knowing, not being able to speak her own language. So, where she is at a given day is really kind of a spectrum. So when I'm meeting a new writer for the first time, I kind of keep these in my background, kind of like on, like a kind of a running script that I know that even though it's not visible, they may be experiencing some of these. But all is not lost, because I think there are many, many ways to overcome these barriers. And when I do meet a writer from these racialized, marginalized communities that have experienced a lot of violence, I'm always surprised by and always, warmed by their generosity, their laughter, their ability to be resilient, and sometimes even discussing the most painful experiences they've had. We just start laughing because there's nothing else you can really do in that situation, the irony of the situation or in the situation. So what I find too is that I meet writers at different stages of trying to overcome and make peace with their own trauma. Denial is one stage I find. I've been in all these 4 stages, and I've also slid back and forth between them all. So there's a tendency to minimize, self-gaslighting I call, like, oh, that didn't really happen, I'm being oversensitive. They deny that there was any kind of racial encounter. They resist exploring their identity and heritage. You don't want to go there. They think, I'm moving forward. I'm Canadian now. I don't really want to go back to the past and talk about those painful incidents like, my grandparents being slaves or being in residential school. And as a result, they want to limit that time that they spent with other individuals that are from similar communities, because they don't want to be really reminded, and they don't want to be, again, pigeonholed into that one identity. And so there's a attempt to assimilate to a degree, only having friends who are Caucasian or kind of lighter-skinned friends. And maybe that's all that's in their community as well. If they're from a smaller town in Canada, they might not find a lot of other individuals that are similar background from them. One of my best friends is Tamil, and she's from Victoria, BC, and she was like, I've never met any other Tamil families, maybe like 1 or 2. And yet my parents expected me to marry a Tamil man. I'm not sure how that's going to happen, So in a sense, this person can lead a double life. Maybe they're one way with their friends and family who are from a similar background, and they are act white when they're with the family. So that's fine. Maybe that person has, I think sometimes people who are in denial do have sometimes, I think, a strong argument. I even know one writer who refuses to publish under his name, his given name, and instead publishes under a different name that sounds more British. So that's a choice that they have. Then sometimes you meet people who are very angry. They show a lot of hostility. And they're very well read in race politics, and that's kind of part of the reason why they're so angry. They see the larger systemic forces at work. The hostility is not really directed to any individual, but it's sort of like a kind of generalized anger towards the system, that things are set against them. They hide their feelings, and I think their wounds and their pains, because it's easier to be angry than to feel wounded. And sometimes, in a very positive way, they fuel all this anger into activism and protest. They're very suspicious. They can be very suspicious. And it takes a lot of time to gain their trust. I really find I have felt this way. Sometimes so I can really understand. But the thing is, if you do meet an individual who is expressing a lot of coldness, not meeting your eye, you offer to publish their work, and you've heard that they're ready to try to be warm and accepting, and you're met with this wall of kind of hostility. It's not about you. It's not about the personal relationship at that time. It's because they are kind of maybe even projecting onto you power structures that they see you as part of. So in that kind of sense, sometimes I'm afraid of that person. I just kind of monitor, and I ask their friends, how they are doing, because I know the next stage for them may be depression, a sense of futility, as they pour in energies into doing all this activist work, and they don't feel things are changing fast enough, and a sense of paralysis, and then a sense of like they can't create or produce anything of worth that's not responding to racism. And then I also find people get depressed and they're ashamed that they aren't doing more and that they're not contributing enough to the community, which leads to depression and paralysis. And therefore then they start to feel, oh, maybe writing isn't really productive. It's not going to change the larger systemic racism at work. And then they begin to shut themselves off. So sometimes I see people going back and forth between these two stages, and it's like, what they want to get them is to just kind of now, let's fuel that emotion and experience into writing. And I do find this does happen, this kind of valuing, like you have a unique story, you have unique experiences, and you need to embrace that, all of it, both the pain and the anger, that's your unique story to tell. And then they begin to pick and choose what systems they can work within and which they can change. And then sometimes they go from this one I found really powerful. Someone's depression is like, I'm not going to focus on myself right now. I'm going to focus on writers around me who are doing really well. And I'm going to amplify those voices even through social media. Particularly the depressed writers will spend way too much time on social media. But then if they can use that in a productive way, they can really find their community and support each other. And then they realize, hey, I just came through all these stages. Like I was in denial, I was angry, I was depressed. I'm very strong, I'm really resilient. And so that's kind of the message I give to writers when I meet them at this stage. And at any point too, I know that a writer who is maybe feeling more positive can at any point slide backwards into feelings of frustration. So even just being aware of that, I think we can create a much more supportive industry and community. Because being a writer, being an editor, a publisher is hard enough. If you aren't dealing with all of those stages, these are all just the challenges that I can think of in terms of being a writer. So the writers I know who aren't dealing with mental health issues are still struggling. Some of these things can give them mental health issues as you try to, the scarcity and surprise of literary awards. I remember when I was nominated for an award, I just was so surprised. It almost made me feeling quite unsettled and a sense of grief almost. I don't want all this attention. The fact that writing is so unsustainable financially for but a very few writers just makes full-grown men I know completely depressed and angry. And then trying to maintain good relationships with your community, particularly in the poetry world, there's always this kind of constant drama, negotiation. And I'm not a publisher or editor, but I can just imagine what some of the challenges may be for you as someone on staff, this sense of what I call the scarcity mindset, that there's never enough time, never enough resources, never enough funding to do everything that you want to do. For example, do more outreach for BIPOC writers, and I really understand that. Dealing with things like readership, where the readership is going, having to keep up with the constantly changing, digital marketing tools, supply chain issues. I just put that because I heard from some of my friends that it was difficult just to get their book physically places. And then, of course, us very demanding and unreasonable artists asking for more and more. And then I put a question mark for any other things I may have missed out on. So I found that, I don't mean to put a dire picture on, industry right now, but when I found this was useful because this is the headspace I'm finding editors are in. This is the headspace I'm finding most Caucasian or white identifying writers to be in. But then this is where I'm finding, if you're meeting a BIPOC writer, they would be doing all that and on top of that feeling one of these things. Unless they're at the self-actualization stage in which they are fully participating and making change as much as they can. And so I find the overlapping of people's interests to be really, really important in order to make change. You can't change industry unless you know what kind of things they're bringing along with them. Particularly because I think of the literary and publishing community and industry as ecosystem. And I made this kind of really quick, because this was faster to do. This was faster to do by hand than it was to do in terms of making it. And that the emerging writer, and I just mean emerging writers, not necessarily BIPOC writers, but like all emerging writers, are meeting the different pools of the literary ecosystem in different ways. You never know how they're going to be accessing the literary ecosystem. They may be, getting through creative writing through, creative writing instructors who themselves are connected institutions. Those instructors may be mentors. These emerging writers may already be bloggers, journalists, readers. They may be already organizers and activists. They may be trying to access, grants so that they can write their book. They'll connect themselves to a writers' union or larger arts organization. So what is useful for me about this is how we can't do this alone, and one thing will affect the other. Maybe the reason why reading series cannot become more diverse is because they're not connected to the writing instructors who will give them, contacts to writers. Maybe the reason why editorial board is not, diverse enough is because they can't get access to the funds that will allow them to be able to hire more, or to do a diversity audit of some kind. So yeah, just this kind of like, where do each of us fit in this ecosystem, and these pools of almost like, almost like water that kind of moving up and down, so that if you have suddenly a surge in membership in writers' union, well, how they're going to affect everything around them, or you suddenly have Canon Council being more generous with their funding, how is that going to affect both emerging writers, publishers, and institutions, right? So from there, we can kind of think about partnerships and collaborations. If you can't do something on your own, if you're a struggling chapbook press editor, where can you find the help to publish what you want and to share knowledge that way? Yeah, so, and another thing that this doesn't point out is that the fact that writers have multiple roles, and everyone has multiple roles. A lot of times we're doing more than one role. I'm sure there are people in this room who are editors, but are also parts of arts organizations on the boards of institutions, and it's just kind of this, you're wearing so many hats that you're not even seeing your forehead anymore, and just like, oh, so many, right? Like, where am I? Like, who is me anymore? I'm just lots of hats, So I have several scenarios in which each scenario is a different situation in which you will encounter an emerging writer. And you may have to make some professional and personal choices. But I'm really interested in knowing, how do you think this situation arose, what preceded it, what's at stake, and then how you could change it. How can you help? How can that change happen? So for example, the first one. So you're an editor, you've worked with a BIPOC writer to publish an essay on tokenizing and the literary prize culture in Canada. And the piece is published, it's widely shared and read, and then you have all these really positive reactions, but of course you get that one writer who feels like BIPOC writers, they should just be more proactive. Stop sounding the victim alarm and giving in to feelings of futility and voicelessness. Besides, prizes should only be given on the basis of literary merit anyway. So that's one kind of situations I have noticed. So if you were an editor in that situation, how would you respond? Yeah, so this actually happened to me, but it was more like I had published this piece about tokenization in literary prizes on my own blog. And then there was another online magazine called A Partisan, where a poet responded saying that I was victimizing myself and that I should just be more resilient. Why am I complaining? And actually her editor, the editor at A Partisan, apologized to me in person but not publicly. So I always thought, well, why didn't you actually say something online? Because I got pretty overwhelmed by a lot of people writing me critiquing her piece, and it was very rhetorically weak, like in terms of the argumentation. But I also think that as an editor, we kind of like have that role of responsibility to support, whatever writers that we publish too. So, yeah, I think we have a lot more power than we realize. I think just even if you're working at a publication that's quite small, because of social media, I think things get shared like really widely these days. So this one is if you're a career writing instructor and one of your students asks where they might be able to find a like-minded community, and they're the only BIPOC student in the class, and their work and their points of view have sometimes made certain students feel a bit uncomfortable. So you get this implicit feeling that what this student really wants is to find maybe someone in their community or a mentor. This is also a mature student who works full-time, and they don't have a lot of money to spend on doing career writing retreats and classes. So what might you do for this case? Yeah, I think a similar scenario happened to a black student in an MFA program in the States that it wasn't even an MFA. I think it was a master's in film, and some of the students had decided to watch a film which blackface had appeared. It was like an old-time film, and the student was so appalled by the whole email thread that they were really uncomfortable, and they were calling out that student. So in this case, I might even suggest something a bit more radical, like if there were students initially who felt uncomfortable about maybe the BIPOC students saying that all whites, are doing this to us and they need to pay reparations, and they're calling up histories and making Caucasian students feel uncomfortable, then maybe diversity training would be helpful to air out that for the whole class. Particularly, sometimes I see that sometimes if there's only one BIPOC student in the class, they can kind of spiral into that kind of anger and depression. I really don't want to get them into that cycle. It might be a useful conversation to have for the entire class and not just for that one student. And I think all the things you're suggesting are great, especially for all the students in the class, connecting them. I think that's what I would hope any good career writing instructor to do. So I know some of these sound kind of mild, but I find they have larger consequences for that, not just the BIPOC writer, emerging writers, but for the health of the ecosystem, as I might call it. I think having a talking circle is like the most cheapest option available. We had at OCAD, we have Indigenous Cultural Competency Training. We get the Ontario Federation of Friendship Centers to come in for a 2-day, training. But part of that was one of the things they did with us was a talking circle, where you're not allowed to speak when someone else is speaking, but everyone, holds the stick or whatever else you feel as though could act like a talking stick and just talk about what made them feel uncomfortable at that time, and kind of gets that conversation started. And I find that there's always healing that happens. Like maybe one white student like, I didn't really like the way you called us all white, in that way. It made me feel very uncomfortable. And then the BIPOC student might be able to address that by saying, well, it's not really about your discomfort, is it? Is your discomfort really the important thing? Maybe I'm not writing for you. Maybe you're not my audience. And those conversations have to happen rather than it all going through the instructor, students coming to you and saying, I felt uncomfortable, and they're not talking to each other. It just means that going forward, after they finish this program, they won't be speaking to each other anymore. Or they'll be like at a reading series and like, oh, there's that student that made me feel uncomfortable, and then they will want to leave. I've seen writers do that. They see someone in the community that triggers that kind of experience that they had in their career writing. Both BIPOC and white identifying students that will happen to, and that's a missed opportunity, I think. Other things, I think, as much as possible, have it happen quickly, before the wound festers. That don't wait till the end of the class. Do it as soon as you can feel it in the class, the discomfort. It's like the hairs in the back of your wrist, and you gotta stop the class, and people can write what they're feeling on a piece of paper and give it to you later, so that you can really, or make it the topic, of the next assignment, so that they can do a self-reflection on what happened, in that conversation, that workshop, in that class. So I think there's some really affordable ways that I can think of that have helped me. Most of the time, BIPOC students just want their experience acknowledged, even that they don't want it to be swept underneath the carpet, everyone pretending everything's okay, everyone else being able to create, without this sense of burden or weight on them, whereas they are the ones kind of are like the whipping boy or the scapegoat in the situation. They're the ones making everyone else feel uncomfortable. Yeah, so it just seems to me, like I have been in this situation where I was the only BIPOC student, and I was asked to explain my work to students who didn't understand my culture, and I felt uncomfortable doing so, and I wish I had spoken up. I even found like a letter I wrote to the program director that I never sent. So I just buried that. I'm like, oh, it was okay. I self-minimized. So like, I survived. I'm resilient now. You know, they didn't mean any harm by it. You know, they all wished me well. Like, you know, their questions were innocent. So I managed to kind of like hold that within myself, which is, yeah. So yeah, it's tough. I think being a career writing instructor is one of the hardest things in the world to do. Yeah, I hope none of you are career writing instructors. Like, I think it takes so much wisdom, you know. Yeah. So so this is kind of similar about socializing after class. So you notice that there's a class that never goes out after class for all the networking events and going to the bar, and that's a Muslim student who doesn't consume alcohol. So, you know, they're missing out on getting to know their classmates as well as their classmates getting to know them, as well as potential networking opportunities. So what might you do? You're a fellow student in the situation, not an instructor. Yeah, I know I had one classmate who was taking care of an elder, like her mother was dying of cancer. So she actually apologized at the end of the year. I'm so sorry I haven't been able to hang out with all you guys, to go to readings and hang out, to go to all the pub meets, and we felt terrible. Like, oh, we should have made time to, you know, hang out with you in different times and spaces rather than you always having to go out. Each of us has, in a way, had to fit ourselves into a slot or a role in a culture, sometimes a very male-dominated culture, in order to kind of be professionally successful, to meet the people that we need to meet to help advance our careers. So I'm also getting more radical about this in terms of book launches. You know, I feel like there was one small press in Toronto always has an annual party in their backyard, and it's just alcohol flowing everywhere. Even the editors are just like handing out, like, I remember one time this editor who was known to be an alcoholic, a poet who has alcohol issues, handing out a tray of like champagne. So you know, it was sort of like, maybe I should have contacted that venue and that press, but like, you know, why not have some non-alcoholic options there? Why not create a safe space to go to if you feel, make sure that people are watching out for the people in the community who are known to have a drinking problem. Even I think, you know, award galas, and I've seen very established writers get completely drunk and violent. So it's like, what can I do to help change this culture of alcoholism so we avoid what happened at UBC and also at Concordia. Yeah. Oh, so much work, so little time. Yeah, okay, so this one, yeah. So this one, yeah, you're a guest editor and you have a very small honorarium to edit pieces for a journal. You solicit one piece that it seems to have a lot of possibility, but ultimately you decide to reject it. But you do have some time to make suggestions on how it could be improved. And then kind of like maybe a few weeks later, this editor sends in a new version, and it's much better. And they say they're a writer of color and that they're really struggling to find editors that they feel a sense of connection with, and also with finding, you know, venues for their work. So you feel like, yeah, this piece has come a long way, and maybe just a little bit more revision. But one, you know the writer won't be paid for their work, for this work, because it's just an honorarium that's provided to you. And you've already maxed out your time that you could spend at editing this piece. To do more revisions as a writer, it's just going to take away time that you need to spend on soliciting other pieces. So how might you support this writer both in the short and the long term? Just keeping a little door open, I think, is like incredibly valuable, because that's one contact, one relationship to build over the future. Yeah. When I think about the core strategies, I was really trying to just think of one. Instead, I came up with like 10. So I was like, right, I didn't talk about this. But yeah, building those relationships, which Emily talked about in our opening today. But having empathy, you know, showing empathy, encouragement. What I like to say to a lot of emerging writers is to just say, I'm looking forward to your book. and right away the sense of, they're accountable to me now, right? They have to get that book out. And giving dignity and respect, not because they are a BIPOC person or because they've been racialized or their experiences, but because they are a human being. And not, I'm sure many of you have sometimes been undervalued, been talked over, not been listened to, your suggestions not taken seriously, people not believing that you have the experience that you do. And I find particularly women of color get that kind of lack of respect, lack of just simple human dignity, which is so key to building relationships. And then I always think too, like if I'm doing something, am I doing it to benefit myself or if I'm doing it to benefit the writer? So in a way, if you proportionally should benefit the emerging writer more, but that, ultimately it comes back to you in that sense of karma. So when I kind of redirect and not be thinking, about my own brand or reputation and identity, but really think about what I would have liked as an emerging writer or emerging professional, and to have that opportunity for them. And what I do when they thank me, usually I'm just saying, you got to pay it forward now. Whatever knowledge I shared with you, you better find some emerging writer at some point in your career, to pass that energy, good energy forward. Creating a safe space just means kind of making sure that any conversation you have with a writer is not a conversation or space where they will potentially also experience anything on that pyramid of hate or any more barriers. So, if you bring them into your board meeting, and they make a suggestions and your fellow, hopefully not, but maybe your fellow coworkers are challenging them, again, talking over them, not listening to them, taking their ideas and not crediting them, you haven't managed to create that safe space and you've damaged the relationship of empathy. And not understanding where they're coming from, how hard it was for them to speak at that time. And then there's some of the spaces that you didn't know existed, so that has been really rewarding for me to go into other people's spaces. And once I'm in those spaces, I can try to participate and be really present in those spaces and to be open to learning new things. Again, I wasn't part of any Black or Indigenous communities. I didn't know any I knew very few other Asian writers when I moved to Toronto. So I was constantly in spaces where everyone in the room was from a different community than me. Sometimes it could be very, very intimidating, feeling out of place, not knowing people, only knowing one person there, feeling as though I was invading that space and not supporting it. But, I found that, just kind of, I'm quiet and introverted anyway, so just kind of sit quiet in the corner and listen and learn. And that I could celebrate their accomplishments without co-opting the conversation and making like, hey, I'm here, selfie, here's all my BIPOC peeps, kind of like, it's not really about my own personal journey, I'm not doing this for like a badge to wear for diversity, but I want to celebrate them, without, I'm just thinking about the Women's March, there were like, sometimes like women who only went to that march, but then also people who've been marching for decades, so it's not that selfies are bad, but you can make it about somebody else. And then I find planning with a long-term sense of vision and purpose. Like, if you're just listening diverse voices for one issue, well, what is your long-term plan? Like, how do you see yourself and your organization, your publication fitting into that literary ecosystem? What do you hope to change? Because for me, it's like I'm in it for the long haul. I want to increase readership. And the only way we can increase readership is by creating new readers. And the only pool I can see for new readers are with newcomers to Canada and populations of readers that have not yet been tapped. We need to actually create these new readers. So that's my long-term goal and plan, and everything I do is oriented towards that. I find the opacity of the publishing industry to be a huge barrier for everybody. Not knowing how much you're going to get paid, what the contract's going to look like, what the promotion strategy will be, how different it is if you're with Coach House and Arsenal Pulp or with other publishers. So I think I try to share my knowledge as much as I can, and to just even being a bit more transparent. Some publications will put all their submission guidelines up front, but there's still a lot of confusion writers come to me asking, am I being too demanding? If you're out, or am I asking for more? Should I ask for more? How do I get myself a spot at a festival? And there's just so much that they don't know. So as much as possible, if you can even share knowledge with one person, and as your organization, can they be a bit more transparent about things? So this idea of soliciting work, if you're met with refusals on the part of a writer, you ask, and you ask, then ask again, like a year later. I don't kind of lose touch with that. I think we talked about that in the morning. But then I had people tell me, male editors tell me that they were always met with no's, from female writers. And then, they didn't really doing that self-examination work of like, why might that be? Is it the way I'm asking? Am I asking them to write a piece that they're not even working on? Am I being conscious of their schedules and how much demand? And maybe it's going back to number 6, right? You don't have a long-term sense of vision, so therefore all your asks are sounding very immediate. You're kind of like, oh, this issue just came up in the news, and somebody wrote something racist. We'd like someone to respond to it right now, and within 2 or 3 weeks, let's write a blog post about it. And it's just like, well, was that planning for a long-term sense of provision and purpose? It's not. It's very reactive and hoping to get, clickbait or create like something viral. So sometimes I find that happens. It's like, anyway, yeah. And then I think remembering that BIPOC writers are knowledgeable in more than one area. Like realizing that they can not just write about diversity, but personally, I love writing about food. And what else will I write about? I was once left out of a request to write for a sports anthology. I was very hurt because I was like, don't you guys know I'm like a huge Canucks fan? I could write pages and pages about the Sutton Twins and how magical they are. So I think it just kind of slipped their radar that, if they could have asked me or any kind of person of color write about sports, it's like really great. And then when I can, I connect BIPOC writers with each other. Sometimes just a simple introduction. I remember being in a room with at a poetry lounge, and Isa Sasha John, who was like this amazing presenter, has 3 books out. I could see there was like another Black emerging writer in the room whose name was Karen, and Karen was just looking at Aisha with these big eyes, like like she was in the presence of her idol. I was just like, Karen, look, do you know Aisha? Like, would you like to meet her? And afterwards, she was so uplifted, and it was something very simple. Aisha herself is very shy, even though she's an amazing performer. So, so the two of them would never have met. Like they would just been like looking at each other from far away. Yeah. So I think we can do a lot. So where are we all hiding? So sometimes I had this question: where do I find the BIPOC writers? And the thing is that sometimes we're already in the room. And what I do notice is sometimes it's about who you're talking to that room. Sometimes at an event or a book launch, I see everyone going to the most important person. We're all talking to that big name writer. They're not talking to that editorial assistant. They're not talking to that intern. Not talking to that shy, BIPOC writer in the corner because they don't think it's worth their time. But I believe strongly that the interns of yesterday become the editors of tomorrow. So the times I have made an effort to like find those people. Sometimes they find me, just to say hi. Thanks so much for selling my book. Thanks so much you're the one person that organizes the event. Send me the email. You're the marketing assistant on this, and so I find they're kind of hiding in plain sight. Particularly for Fuel for Fire, when we did that event, it was free for anyone to register as long as they self-identify as BIPOC. And I was really surprised by the number of people I didn't know there. And a lot of them told me that they were lawyers or doctors or working in university administration, but they were also creative writers. So they're kind of hiding in plain sight because they went into different fields, but were always writing at the same time, and very few of them had been published. So sometimes I find that happens with older writers, like Vincent Lam's a really good example of this. He's a doctor who was also writing fiction. So of course, from my community, we all hate him. You're like basically the perfect son. yeah. We just like don't even talk to us about that. And then for the younger generation, often they're in like non-standard spaces. So cheap, free basements, you know, in like random community centers holding a book launch for a Muslim Canadian writer that no one's ever heard of. And it's like way outside of downtown core in North York. And sometimes you have to go outside the spaces you normally go to for reading, like libraries and things like that, to find these writers. So I find finding them before they're published writers is like it's like digging through, you know, it's kind of like mine. And then once you find one, you find them all. It's really strange. I don't know why. I'll meet one original writer, and then we build a relationship of trust. Maybe I've helped them with a piece. And then suddenly they're like, oh, I have a friend who also writes. You know, and then I look into that friend like, oh, she's running workshops already, but she's not published a lot. So, and then that friend connects me to somebody. So it's really great when I find that one person. I met a Filipino writer named Shirley Cameo from Winnipeg, and it's like through her, met like 10 other Filipino writers, all from, you know, Winnipeg or around that area. I was like, where were you all hiding? Like, you know, where did you all come out? And she had the amazing attendance for her book launch because Filipino community in Winnipeg is huge. And that was a whole untapped audience, and the press kind of missed out on an opportunity to get the local Filipino news station in to record that, and so it was really, really amazing. So this is where we all are. Yeah, not places that I think this really makes sense because our culture prioritizes one kind of you know, spaces, and that's the space of the dominant mainstream culture. So, you know, theaters and coffee shops and rental spaces like this. But then if you're from a marginalized community, you won't feel comfortable in those spaces because you don't see yourself represented. So you're going to go outside to kind of interesting, different spaces. Yeah, sometimes you even like find that they've made their own space. Like in case of in Toronto, we have this new cafe, just I think called Tea Leaf or something, and it's been now a hub for all the Asian artists to do events and programming. It's like in the bottom of one of those 1990 Chinese malls that look like you stepped into Hong Kong. It's just like this like neon assault, right? And lots of like little vendors, like grannies around selling like tea eggs. And I'm like, oh, I never would have expected to find like a venue here or a space here being used by like young emerging creative artists and designers. So yeah, it's like being on radar. Okay, so well, it's going so fast. So I talked a little bit earlier about doing a diversity audit. So when I looked at a magazine, you know, something like I picked up a whole bunch, like Quill and Choir, for instance. I was looking at the themes and the content of what they're publishing, and I think about who the reader is. You know, is it they really have me in mind? Would I feel comfortable being published in there? Is the work that they're showing is only like very narrow? You know, they're talking about like, you know, this millennial city dweller going on 3-day music festivals in the desert on a unicycle. There are those magazines that kind of are for that audience, and is that me? Do I see myself in that content? And then this second one really helped us at the Puritan magazine. I was doing outreach for them, but I just had the staff sit down to talk about diversity, what diversity means to them. And interestingly enough, it turned into a conversation about what they were all reading, what they had read in university, what they had taken in English Lit in university, and therefore what their tastes were now. So then we had a conversation about how we were soliciting work and finding writers. And then we looked at like all the writers, like because all the editors were communicating with writers on their own. We were looking for the patterns of those writers and pieces that fell through the cracks, that didn't get published, that didn't meet our standards, that we had maybe edited too rigorously, and the writer got exhausted because Puritan actually put the writers through 4 rounds of edits, and it was crazy at that time. Like they were all pretty young and had a lot of energy. They just went kind of crazy with fact checking, and it was really great because it was one of 2 magazines in Canada online that got Canada Council funding. But yeah, they really edited their pieces, and I would get interviews back with all kinds of track changes and things. And sometimes writers would just be like, "I'm tired of this." It's like 3 rounds of edits for like a book review. Like I don't have the time and energy. And then I just counted the number of new writers I've solicited and published in the previous year, just to kind of do that continual audit? Like, are we publishing people that we already know and have known, or how many new voices have we brought in? I look when I'm looking at publication or organization if they have a mission and value, a vision or mission statement. I was recently asked to join the editorial board for a poetry press, and that was one of my first questions. And I printed out a list of the 2 poetry books they've been publishing every year since they started the press. And it was really apparent right then that they had not published any BIPOC writers. And I think they had published some queer writers and some writers with disabilities. And I think the editor was a bit embarrassed, especially when he was talking to me as part of someone to join the editorial board. So then I asked them, do you have a vision and mission? Oh, no, we don't. We just publish what we like. I'm like, okay, I guess you only like one type of poetry. So I find it's really important to write a vision statement just as a conversation for your staff, and to state that the work is welcome from many types of backgrounds. Sometimes vision statements are a nice way to acknowledge the original founders of the organization. Sometimes they've moved on. Sometimes those are BIPOC folk who have done that work and someone else has taken over. And then I find it very therapeutic to write one of these. So I always look to see where I can find it. I think the one that Book Hug Press is a pretty good one. It's a little wordy, but it's all right. They mean well. So when I look at a publication, I don't really see like a land acknowledgement in it. I kind of already feel like they're already kind of missing out on one perspective. So even this one, I'm saying, okay, great, we're here, we're queer, now what? Oh, that's a conversation I want to be in on. Like, I want to hear from queer voices and learn from that. So even just the covers of some of these were really telling for me. This one, Briar Patch, was I think they're probably like met all of these things. So like even on the back, it's so cute. Yeah. So even the advertisements to me kind of speak to diversity. But I thought that these are some other strategies I could think of, and some of them are mixed, some good and some bad. Some have some mixed benefits and disadvantages. I had originally thought that we could do this on a whiteboard in terms of thinking about the negatives. But for example, initially I saw a lot of special issues focusing on one identity. So say the special issue in Caribbean writing, and then that will grow to like an anthology. Caribbean writing Canada, from 1860 to, 1945, things like that. And then I would see inviting a BIPOC guest editor to solicit work. I've seen that happen. New editorial board, and then partnering collaboration with other organizations. Special issues are a political move as well, I think. The fact that there is so much attention to Indigenous voices now is to make up for a lack. I think you brought up that they have good and bad points. Like, there's a kind of ghettoization that happens. We get all grouped into one issue. So maybe the theme of your special issue could be something like, I'm hungry, getting hungry. So maybe just the idea of pork. How would that affect? Imagine if you did a special issue, if you're a food magazine, and did this, or even a literary magazine. Let's do an idea of the food pork, and then you would get like a cross section that's a banned food for Jewish, Orthodox and Muslim communities, but very treasured for Asian communities. So something like that might be, or porches. I'm thinking about Oaxaca porches. Like, why not be that way to start a conversation? So I think I like theme-based social issues that contain a cross section, or even idea of treaty. Like, what are perspectives on treaty? So that that kind of conversation can happen. I think they can be very useful, because say you were in an anthology of Indian writers under 35, suddenly you would meet all those other people in the anthology, but maybe that can happen in a different way, like a reading series or podcast. We could take the podcasting class tomorrow and learn how to do that. Yeah. Okay. So I think this is more of an exercise for you to think through about which strategy for you, your organization, would have pluses and benefits, and even what you have time, resources for. So I noticed a lot of different organizations trying out different strategies like this with different results. Okay, so just to end with some success stories and really positive things that I've been seeing people do and that I learned from. So this grew out of Beautiful Fires, what I mentioned earlier. I don't know what got into me doing a conference. Why I thought this would be a good way to spend the same weekend of March. It was like early March 2017. My book came out and I had to go to Ottawa for a festival, so it was just kind of insane. But I think that Ontario Arts Council had already done something very similar for BIPOC artists, and Bushra Janae she's had art from the art background. So they were kind of looking to do this in the literary world. They didn't really know, I think, who to ask, even though they have a huge database of like writers across Ontario. But they saw my blog post on tokenization. It got really widely shared, and I ran into the literary officer, Jack Ellingsworth, in a bar, and he said, we should have a sit down, have a conversation about what we could do. And so in my mind, I'd always wanted to do this. I'd always want to have a conference where it was about publishing, but with the perspective of writers of color. And so I went home and I wrote up like something like a proposal, and it basically had 4 panels: one on community, one on publishing, one on writing, one on grants. And I want to fill each of those panels with people of color. So that's what we did, and we had a keynote the night before, and it was just one day, and it was filled, because it was free, it was filled that weekend with 100 writers who registered. And we really regretted not renting the bigger room. The room that we rented in the Toronto Reference Library was slightly bigger than this. But she said, if we had gone for the bigger room, the Bloom Appel Salon, we would have been able to fit in 200 writers. So it was really nice, intimate discussion. And so that's some of the tweets. That's J.L. Richardson, who started Fold Festival of Literary Diversity. Amazing woman. She also wrote a memoir about her father, who's a football player. She herself is one of the successful stories. And then Isha Chatterjee, who was at that time the president of the League of Poets. And the reason I joined the League of Poets was because of her visibility, and she was so warm. And then Anna Yin, at that time, was like the poet laureate of Mississauga. And then Leonica Valnius, who I think have spoken at MagsWest before, who is a champion for diverse CanLit, is now sales. I think she was a sales representative for Doubleday, and is now launching her own agency. So it's kind of amazing, actually, that they're all women, of course. I couldn't find any male, writers of color men who are doing a lot of community work, but hopefully I will one day. Yeah, there must be. I think at the University of China Press, I don't know why, it was tough. I knew some reading series hosts who were black and male, but yeah, not a lot doing this kind of community work. So Dion Brand, who was my editor for my book, heard that I had this gathering of diverse writers, and she wanted to host one. So I was like, you want 10 BIPOC writers to show up at your house that you've never met before? Sure. So we had a meeting at her house. We all went around. They were all incredibly intimidated to be sitting in her very clean house. She was incredibly clean, on all her like poofs and Moroccan cushions. And so she heard about all of our projects and said, you guys should do anthology. And we're like, okay, yeah, no, but we're all so busy. And then she's on the board of Toronto Lit Up, which is an initiative funded by Toronto Arts Council that funds like book launches in Toronto. So if you were launching a book, you can apply for them for like a little bit of funding. And the Toronto Lit Board also included Hazel Millar from Book Hug Press. So they offered to publish an anthology, and we got a little creative with the Toronto Lit Up funding, and that all the writers in it were paid not to write, but to appear at the book launch. So having this book launch meant that they were all paid for the writing, just about, I think it was like $125. But for some of these writers, it was like, the most they'd ever made for their writing. Particularly since the piece is really short, like about 500 words. So it's just a little slim volume. Is I think been repeated. I think it's now on its 3rd reprint, because it was nominated for Toronto Book Awards, which we totally didn't expect, and was on the short list. So because of that, it created a lot of other opportunities for the writers to appear at things like this panel at word on the street in Toronto. So that Kinesia is moderating, and we have the other 4 or 5 writers who had pieces in that anthology. And yeah, we got I think honorarium for also participating in Toronto Book Awards. It was more money that we could divide up and share between 17 writers, but it was really, really great. Doya Islam has a book coming out next spring in a month. Sanchari Sur in the middle has a reading series that she runs at Waterloo called Balderdash that she's partnered with New Quarterly to do, and features a lot of diverse writers. So it was a pretty amazing group of women. So then Kinesia and I also worked together on the second anthology of prose. So that was really, really great to do. An incredible amount of time. We weren't really paid for any of that work, but it was really nice to work on. And then this is full, something I look forward to every year. It doesn't run every year. I think it's running this year, last year, and then 2 years ago. So they had funding issues their second year of operations and had to skip a year. And there's something I've been meaning to volunteer for a lot. But just attending is amazing because it's the most diverse literary festival I've ever been at. It's in Brampton, which I think really smart because you're not competing with what's going on in Toronto, and it's not really that far from Toronto. So I think if you're in a smaller community, it's not impossible to hold a literary festival. Yeah, it's a really nice challenge. And then I noticed this. I don't know if you heard about this when Wosak and Win, Paul Vermeech wanted to form a new editorial board, and he asked Jordan Abel, Jen Fuchshin-Lee, and Kinesia Lubin to join. So I think they're just coming out with their first books for next year. And Paul said that he just got a lot of questions from other editors, like, how did you fund this? How did you make it possible? And it came, he said he had wanted to do this for a long time, but Kinesia put on her Facebook, how many writers under 40 can you think of who are Canadian and black and female? And no one could ever answer. The only person she could find was Ezia Gulen, who's 40. And that made Paul decide to put together this editorial board. So we'll see what comes out of it. This, I am such in awe. I bow down to Vivek Shraya for creating a lot of positivity just at a time when there was a lot of negativity in CanLit. She created a mentorship program. She mentored one writer completely free of charge, and then has imprints with Arsenal Pulp Books, and for her own press, VS Books. And so they're publishing their first author, Thea Mushundi from Scarborough, who is also an unpublished city author too. So that book is coming out this spring. Just so excited that I really think that when you think you can't do that much, I think of Vivek as just one person kind of uplifting so many just through, and she writes like children's books and poetry, and it's just like very inspiring. Yeah. And then here are some other recent titles that for me have been very uplifting to see. I think that anyone who works with BIPOC Writers should have Greg Young's book. It's incredibly generous. Leanne Simpson has been very helpful for me guiding through notions of cultural appropriation and tokenization. I always go back to her teachings when I think about whose story I can use. Whitney French just published this from the University of Regina on Black Writers Matter. It's an incredible anthology just good storytelling. When I read them, like, to me it doesn't seem, it's very relatable, a lot of the stories about poverty. And then one of my former professors, Karina Vernon, has done this whole anthology on the Black Period archives that I'm really looking forward to, because I've never seen a lot of writing about, the periods from a BIPOC perspective. So those are just some of the things that I'm finding to help me understand those who have experienced more discrimination than me. So I think, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry for keeping you. So I'm just going to hand out what I use for my checklist, but also for my wish list as a resource. And on my wish list, it's sort of like just starting off a bit soft with what you might have intention to do. So, like, for example, I intend to explore my own heritage, identity, and relationship with colonization. So if that's something you're already doing, you can check that off. Or I'm a big bullet journal fan, so I really like checklists. And then maybe it's something that's on your wish list, and maybe it's something you can't do now but soon. But I also have things like I want to start a conversation about inclusion about my organization. Maybe that's something you can do, or you're already doing, or that you can do in the future. Or to create opportunity for emerging writer to perform and publish their work and get paid for it. So I think that each of you in this room can probably have a really big ripple effect when you kind of start with that sense of intentionality. Yeah. So thank you all so much. Oh, and finally, my contact info, if you have any questions, is alittleprint.com or Phoebe at littleprint. And I'm also on Twitter. It's the only social media I really enjoy.